All right. Great to see everyone. Thanks for joining us. This week, we have the incredible privilege of studying a Haftarah that we very, very rarely read. Most of the time, Parashat Miketz is on Hanukkah. And so the Haftarah is bumped off for Shabbos Hanukkah. And when Shabbos has two, well, I'm sorry, when Hanukkah has two Shabbases, Hanukkah always has at least one. But when Hanukkah has two Shabbases, you have Miketz and maybe Vayeshev. So you have two Haftarahs for Hanukkah, and still Miketz gets bumped off. But this year, because Hanukkah finishes on Friday, so Shabbos is regular, for lack of a better term, we have the Haftarah for Miketz. And so we're able to study the Haftarah for Miketz together. The Haftarah for Miketz is this famous story from perhaps one of the most famous stories of kings of Melachim, which is the famous story of cutting the baby in half, or threatening to cut the baby in half, as we will see shortly. It is Melachim Aleph, Kings 1, chapter 3, 1 through 15, and then chapter 3, 15 through 4:1, through the beginning of the fourth chapter, verse 1. And you can almost see by that sort of weird picking that part of the message of the Haftarah and this whole story is to cement, firm up, make sure that Shlomo's rule in the shadow of King David's loss, is firm. If you recall, we've actually looked at verse 1, chapter 1, chapter 2 a little bit. That's the whole story of Abishag and the Bathsheba and Natan sort of colluding with David to make sure that Shlomo becomes the next king. And we've read, I don't remember if we haven't yet, but we will get to. We get to the last will and testament that David gives to Shlomo about what to do, who to take care of, who not to take care of, who to take care of positively, who to take care of negatively. All of that we will read in Parashat Vayechi. And so this is the later part. Shlomo is the king now. And the Haftarah actually begins in the middle of a story. We are chapter 3, verse 15. Vayikatz Shlomo wakes up, V'nei Chalom, and behold, it was a dream. Right, so right off the bat, we sort of see a little bit some connection to the Parsha. Right, our Parsha Miketz is about dreams, interpretations of dreams from last week's Parsha. What dream is Shlomo referring to here? What's the dream that we're sort of waking up from? Anyone?
Yeah, the dream was that he went to Yerushalayim and stood before the Beit HaMikdash, I guess.
Right, so he has a dream, and God appears to him and basically says, what do you want? You're going to be the leader. You're going to be the leader. What do you want? And Shlomo famously says, Shlomo says, Shlomo famously says, V'ata v'avadecha b'toch amecha asher b'charta am Rav. There's so many Jews, so many opinions, so many different perspectives. Natati lavadecha lev shomea. Give to your servant a heart to hear, lishpot et amcha, to judge your nation properly, to understand. This is one of my pet peeves, and I just violated it. The verse, hold on, let me Let's look at it together. V'avadecha, right? Verse number 9, right over here. Do you see it? So this is right before Haftarah. Natati lavadecha, give to your servant. God asks, what do you want? So what is this shlo? And God says you can have all these different things. We'll get to that in a second. Lev shomea, a heart. What does shomea mean? So I said a listening heart, right, to hear. But it's really, lishmoa means so much more in Hebrew. Shema Yisrael doesn't mean hear, O Israel, right? That's like the worst translation in the world. And it's not the worst, but it's not the right translation. It means to understand. It means to understand, right? How do we know this? So, for example, in this week's Parashat, we're going to read, right? What happens? Yosef pretends to not understand the brothers, right? And the brothers are talking in front of him. And the verse says, Velo yada, they didn't know, ki shomea Yosef, that Yosef was listening, ki hamelitz, because the translator was between them, right? What? Someone who's speaking a different language, I can't hear? No, it means he couldn't understand. That Shema in Hebrew means to understand, not necessarily to hear. So what he's saying over here is, give me a heart to understand the people, lishpot et amcha, to judge your nation, lahavin ben tov lara, to know between good and bad, ki mi yuchal lishpot et amcha hakaved hazeh. Who could judge the Jewish people? They're so hard. There's such a such a diverse nation with so many different needs. It's very hard to judge. So who's going to be able to judge? God, give me the wisdom to. Does God like this? God loves this. God was thrilled that Shlomo asked for this and asked particularly for this. God said to them, Yan asher sha'alta et advar zeh, because you asked for this, below, and you didn't ask for yamim rabim, lengthy days, lo osher, not wealth, nefesh avadecha, nefesh oivecha, the soul of your enemies, meaning to wipe out your enemies. But you asked lecha lavin lishmoa mishpat, to understand language, to understand judgment. V'hinei asiti kidvarecha, I'm going to do like what you asked. V'hinei natati lach, I will give to lecha, I will give to you lev chachma, a heart of wisdom. V'navon asher kamocha lo hayu lefanecha, that there was never before or after. V'gam, and also I'm going to give you all the other things. Meaning, part of what Shlomo receives in this moment is he asked for he asked for the right thing. God is so excited and gives him everything. Verse 15, where our Torah starts. Vayikat Shlomo wakes up from this dream. V'hinei chalom, and it's a dream. Now, this is clearly similar to Miketz. On a superficial level, our Haftarah and our Parsha are linked because Paro also is Vayikatz Paro. Paro gets up. But we'll come back to that. Vayavo Yerushalayim. He's not in Yerushalayim. He comes to Jerusalem. He stands before the Aron, the covenant of God. Vayal Olot. He brings offerings to God, Olot. Vayash Shlamim, and he makes shlamim, a different type of sacrifice. Vayas Mishtel Cho Avadav, and he makes a festival for all of his a feast for all of his servants, in gratitude and recognition, and any of these different pieces. It's important, I guess, just to note, just semantically or syntactically, Vayal Olot, he brought up Olot, Ola offerings. Ola offerings are completely burnt. There are no byproducts that humans eat. And therefore it makes sense that's Vayal Olot, that he raised up Ola burnt offerings because they're totally burnt. Vayas Shlamim, he made the Shlamim. The Shlamim is the sacrifice that yields meat for the bringer, for the giver, for the sacrificer as well. And that makes sense then why he made a festival, because now he had this meat from the sacrifice that he had brought that he needs to now sacrifice. All right. Then what happens? cue the scene. And we have to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Is this just like a happenstance? Is this some proof to Shlomo that he got the wisdom, or to everyone that he got the wisdom? All of that are open for interpretation. Az tavona shnei nashim zono. Two prostitute women, women prostitutes come before the king, and they appeared before the king. Right, and this is the famous case of the baby. I want to just point out, yeah, Chuck.
I've often wondered, why do they have to specify zonot? In other words, these could be widows or whatever. I mean, it seemed like an extraneous piece of information with the rest of the story.
Part of it's what happened, right? The Gemara gives a whole long trident interpretation of like why this happened, what's going on here, and all of that. Not going to deal with that right now, but the Gemara has this idea that maybe they're mother and daughter or daughter-in-law, and depending on whose baby this is, their Yibum rights and this and that. There's a whole story to that. But I actually think there's a much more profound part here. Part of the role of the Jewish king is to judge the nation for everyone, right? Shlomo's vision is this wisdom to judge everyone. The Jewish community is diverse, and it's not just the highest, but the lowest also. And perhaps part of the intentionality of the story is to highlight that who gets the audience with the king to sort of show the king's great wisdom, right? That the king's going to put his brain power to this seemingly inscrutable issue. Two women who represent the lowest rung of the social society. And it's not uncommon for that to happen. We have a number of cases in Tanakh where the access to the king to a Jewish king seems to be very open, right? And that's important to be the case. And that's sort of a model. The Jewish king isn't this exalted, vaulted person above everyone, but really is actually there that people should be able to find an audience and present it to the king. You have, for example, in Malachim, a couple of chapters later, either six or seven, Shlomo's sort of walking, and a woman like cries out on the wall and says, "Help me, help me." Not Shlomo, excuse me. This is Malachim Bet. So this is later on, not important for right now. You have in Shmuel, you have situations where you have someone from Tekoa who sort of shows up and beseeches the king. This idea that random people get audiences with the king seems to be in line with like what is the appropriate model of what a king should be: open, accessible to the citizenship. Outside the palace, the king needs to be able to hold sort of open judicial courts. The Gemara gives the example that when we say David's hands is filled with blood, not necessarily the reason why he can't build the temple. That's a separate conversation. But it's what his hands are bloody with, answering questions about like shrita and stuff like that, not of war. So there's this model of a king that is accessible, that has access to the whole gamut of the citizenry, and judges. And that part of the story is that. And the fact that it's so murky, like it's not even like, there are proofs one way or another, but Shlomo sought to apply justice across. This might be, this is sort of the broader theme, like what do we understand this story's role, right? It's not just Shmuel, Shlomo, David. These stories aren't just like a history book. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened, right? There are lots of stories that happen to Shlomo, for sure. Why is this one captured? The question is, what message is trying to convey? So one line is to try to understand that this is just a proof positive of Shlomo's great sensitivity to the people and ability to access great wisdom. So take an inscrutable case that have no proofs or indications one way or another, which will push back whether that's the case, and add to that it's the lowest level of society, right? It's these two prostitutes. And therefore, that's what we have it. So that detail is clearly very, very important, potentially. So what happens? Let's just back to our case. I mean, most of the time when we study this Haftarah, we don't get the full picture of that. We don't get the full picture of what that is. So let's talk about the next one. Well, let's talk about what happens. Vatomer Haisha Achat. One woman stood before the king and said, Bi'adon, please, my king, my master. Ani va'isha azot yoshevet b'bayit echad. We're living in one house. Va'eled ima b'bayit. And I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. B'nei, and behold, on the third day, va'telet gam haisha azot. This other woman also gave birth. Va'nachnu yachdav. There's no one else with us. There's no one else there. We were alone by ourselves. Vayamat ben Haisha Hazot, the child of this one died. Asher shachva alav, that she laid on it, smothered it. Vatakam batoch halayla, and she came in the middle of the night. Vatikach et bini me'etzli, she took my son from next to me. And switched them, and basically left her dead son with me. And in the morning, when I got up to nurse, I realized that the baby this child was not my child, and this child's not alive. Vatomer Haisha Acheret, the other woman said, Lo, no, ki bini hachai. No, my son's alive. Your son is dead. Zot omeret lo ki bincha mate. No, yours is alive. Mine is alive. And that's basically what they were saying before the king, right? There's this dispute. Vayomer hamelach zot, and the king sort of summarizes. This is actually an interesting expression, right? And we see this in like practical mediation practices today, right? That you're supposed to sort of repeat to the people what you're hearing. I'm hearing from you that you're saying that the son that's alive is mine and the son that's dead is hers. And you're saying, no, your son is dead, my son's alive, right? He's just repeating it back. Famously, what does Shlomo say? Vayomer hamelech, chuli charev, bring for me a sword. They take a sword before. Vayomer hamelech, and the king says, we're going to cut the baby in half of the baby for one, half the baby for the other, and that's what we'll do. But Tomar Isha, it's interesting. One of the commentaries say that they're going to cut the baby lengthwise, meaning up and down. Obviously, it's not really what Shlomo meant, but it's just interesting that a commentary thought that this was like a question someone had that they needed to clarify, but whatever. But Tomar Isha, Asher Bina Hachai, that already the Torah now puts the Navi is putting their finger on the scale. The one whose really the real mother. Ahamelech, because she had mercy on her son. Vatomer bi Adoni, tenula et ha yalud hachai, give her the alive son, but don't kill him. V'zot omeret gamli, gamlach, lo yeh, cut them in half. Right? You won't have it, I won't have it. Vayan hamelech vayomer tnula, give it to this one, and don't kill it because that is her mother. Vayishmeu kol ha'am, this is the end of the verse. Et hamishpat asher shafat hamelech. They all heard what Shlomo ruled. And Vayiru Mivnei HaMelech, and they were in awe of the king. Ki ra'u ki chachmat Elokim b'kirbo la'asot mishpat, where he had possessed the divine wisdom to execute judgment properly, justice properly. Vahi HaMelech Shlomo Melech al Kol Yisrael, and that consolidates his leadership, his kingship, his domain over all the people. Right, until he's able to establish himself as a formidable judge, as someone with great wisdom. That is what ultimately, it's not his strength, it's not anything else we've talked about so far. It's ultimately his wisdom and his ability to execute justice that cements his role as the king. So we just went through the story. Tell me, in your impression, what's the role of this story? Why is it here? Well, let's leave our parsha for a second. In the narrative of Melachim, what's the role of this? Anyone?
Probably suggest that he's a worthy successor to David HaMelech.
Meaning the story is being told to us to highlight that he's a worthy successor to David HaMelech.
And I would say that it's establishing his wisdom, which is really what Shlomo is known for most of all.
Right. Establishing his wisdom. Right. And so the point of this is show and tell, right? And even though, or part of that question could be, did Shlomo know who the right mother was before he suggested this? Maybe, right? According to some of the commentary, Shlomo already sussed out. Like, what was this idea with cutting the thing? Shlomo sussed out what was going on. Shlomo knew who was the liar, who was the true. The whole charade of bring me the sword and we're going to cut the baby in half and everyone can gasp and breathe and this and that was theatrics, was to highlight to everyone around him that he was right. Because if he would just say, oh, you're the mother, you're not, well, there'll be team A and team B. And, maybe the king got it right, maybe he didn't. How can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt? Shlomo does this whole thing. And maybe, I'll even go one step deeper, it could be that people even recognize in the end of the day that Shlomo was doing this. And they were so impressed that Shlomo not only was able to execute justice, was able to do it in a way that was clear to all the bystanders of who the right person was. How unbelievable was that, right? Shlomo was able to play not just what the right answer was, and not just to elicit it beyond a reasonable doubt, but do it in a way that would convince everyone around him, right? Is it such a wisdom after this is over to know who the mother is? No. The one who says, how asinine is it to say, cut the baby in half, kill the baby in front of us. Could you imagine that? Right? That's not the chachma. The chachma is getting them as sort of the cross-examination up to that point, right? So one way, as Renana highlights, is to look at this as sort of this through line, where Shlomo is able to cement his kingdom in a way that creates a broader acceptance, cements his knowledge, his wisdom, his ability to execute justice, not just because he's able to do it. One thing for him to know what's right, but to be able to do that in a way that's so transparent that everyone around him knows. Any other way to look at this story? Anyone?
I think it's possible to look at it as having been for Shlomo's benefit to convince Shlomo that of the validity of the dream and his worthiness and ability to rule.
Exactly. Another way of looking at this is that it's not for the people's benefit, and maybe that's why the break is sort of before it, right? It's for Shlomo's benefit. All of a sudden, Shlomo gets this wisdom, and here we have this case that's inscrutable, and Shlomo's able to crack it like butter in his hands, right? Sorry, the mixed metaphor, right? Shlomo's able to cut right through it without any problem, right? And do it in such a way, again, everything I just said, Shlomo figured out who the right person was, orchestrated in a way that was clear and transparent to everyone. All of that wasn't people facing, it was Shlomo facing. Look, Shlomo, God gave you that wisdom, right? So that's definitely another way of looking at it. I think, and we have to ask ourselves, what's the role of this story in Tanakh? What dimension of Shlomo does it seek to convey? I wonder, and here's a take I'm going to share. I heard it referenced by by a colleague, not a colleague, a teacher of mine, Rabbi Alan Schwartz, who's very much, he's a Bible professor at YU, has a lot of focus on this. I wanted him to give a lecture about Shlomo, and he referenced this idea. He didn't develop it as much. I'm going to develop it a little bit more. But he basically began, well, everything we've said so far is positive, right? Everything we've said so far is positive in Shlomo, right? This was good. Either it proved it for Shlomo or proved it for the people. What if we looked at this negatively? In particular, it's possible that maybe this story wasn't even supposed to be taken that way. But in our context of it being chosen for our Parsha, it is. What's our whole story? So obviously there are a lot of connections to our Parsha, right? These two dreams, the idea of royalty coming through this wisdom, right? Shlomo ultimately cements his leadership because of this wisdom, this genius, this ability to discern, complex realities, which is exactly what happens in our Parsha with Yosef, right? Yosef's able to not only interpret the dreams, but give Paro an action plan, X, Y, and Z, a famine stimulus idea, which ultimately, leads to Yosef becoming the ruler. That's definitely part of the story. You have this piece. It's possible there's a connection with the whole father and mother fear of losing a child, which is a motif throughout Miketz as well. There are those pieces, but perhaps part of the question is an accusation against Yosef, right? Was it really right for Yosef to do all of these things against his brothers, right? To conspire, to scare, to trick. Now, we have commentaries, the Barbanel, say, no, Yosef wanted to make sure that they really did tshuva properly, right? And how could he do them? Clearly Yosef knew the Rambam's Hilchot Tshuva, right? The laws of tshuva. I say with half sarcasm, right? And you can only do tshuva properly if you're in the exact same position. So how did he do it? He orchestrates this whole crazy ruse that Binyamin is going to be taken back and he's going to have a good reason and blah, 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 all of that. Maybe. And there's the Ramban who thinks that Yosef thinks his father's in on it, right? That Yaakov was part of Yosef being sold to slave, and that's why Yosef never called him. It's very possible. But maybe part of the critique of the Haftarah is that Yosef went too far, right? That Yosef should not have done this. Part of the challenge of Yosef is that he had unchecked power. After all, he was the viceroy of Egypt. And he was able to do whatever he wanted with that unchecked power, and even in sort of an impetuous way, act. And maybe that's part of the story with Shlomo as well, right? Maybe part of this story is that Shlomo has this great wisdom and everything that goes on, but we foreshadow one of Shlomo's flaws, that Shlomo is also sort of impetuous. And Shlomo also is sort of, this whole idea, let's cut the baby in half. And you just imagine the whole court gasping as there's a knife. They really brought the sword. Like, is that really the image Shlomo wants to project of himself to the people? Sure, he has the power to do that, but should he have? And this whole idea of cutting in half, if you look at David also is told at one time to cut something in half. If you recall, there's a territory that belongs to Shaul that is given to David when he becomes king, and he gives it to Mephibosheth, who is Yonatan's son. Mephibosheth's hiding. He's worried that David's going to settle the score, and David says, "Don't worry, I made a covenant with your father that we won't, that your children, that his children will be safe." And he gives him the land. He gives him the property, and he gives him servants to maintain it, right? And then what happens? There is a rebellion against David. Everyone flees who's with David, but Mephibosheth stays in Jerusalem. And the head servant who is over the property for Mephibosheth essentially says Lashon Hara to David and says, don't you know, when everything was ever, Mephibosheth stayed in Jerusalem, hoping that all the Davidic line would wipe themselves out, and then he would reassert his leadership, and he would become the king and take back the dynasty for Shaul. Now, is that true at all? Absolutely not. Why does Mephibosheth stay in Yerushalayim? Because Jerusalem's like the young Israel. Both are not handicap accessible. Mephibosheth is told that or it's very hard. Mephibosheth, we're told, is disabled, is not able to walk. And so Mephibosheth that's not the real reason. He doesn't support David's rebellion. He's just not able to lead. And the Gemara actually takes David HaMelech to task for believing in the Lashon Hara about Mephibosheth. So this guy basically conspires to forget his name, the head servant, Zerah. I'm blanking on the name right now. That's what happens when you get like 3 hours of sleep. David gives him the portion. He says, instead of you being the servant, you should take it. Mephibosheth comes before David just to clear his name, that he was not with the rebellion, and David has no patience for it, and basically kicks him out and says, "Go split the property." Same language. Go split the property. And again, the Chazal, our rabbis, are very critical of David. They'll defend him for Bathsheba. They give all these excuses for Uriah. But when it comes to Mephibosheth and the Lashon Hara, they are very, very critical of David HaMelech. Again, this sort of impetuous, ready, fire, aim judgment that comes up. And this might give us a sort of a different vantage point to Shaul and Shlomo, that comes up. And it's possible to read it in a much more critical lens, particularly when read in context of the Yosef story. And then at the very end, instead of Vayishma Kol Yisrael et Mishpat Asher Shafat HaMelech, Vayiru Mipnei HaMelech, not that they were in awe, but they feared him. Right? Who's this crazy king? You bring him a dispute and he wants to cut a baby in half? Right? It doesn't necessarily need to be so positive here. And that is perhaps another way of looking at it, that presents to us a very different picture of what might be part of this narrative, and a very critical picture of what might be part of the Yosef story. So that's another way, and maybe that's part of the challenge that we're talking about, part of the reality that we are looking at with Yosef, that maybe the Haftarah is sort of a hidden criticism of Yosef. Right? It's all the things we talked about also. There's the dream, there's the wisdom that leads to leadership, there's the concern for parents and for children, but maybe it's also sort of a little bit of a critique of Yosef for going too far, for taking things just because he could, to take all the brothers for this whole ride might have been inappropriate. So it's a different way of looking at the story, and perhaps the Haftarah gives us a lens into that. Let's stop here. I'll take any questions as we get